Reading from Daniel 11, verses 2 through to 35. And now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a 4th shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. And as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided towards the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these. Then the king of the south shall be strong, but one of his princes shall be stronger than he, and shall rule, and his authority shall be a great authority. After some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure. But she shall be given up, and her attendants, he who fathered her, and he who supported her in those times. And from a branch from her roots one shall arise in his place. He shall come against the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he shall deal with them and shall prevail. He shall also carry off to Egypt their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold, and for some years he shall refrain from attacking the king of the north. Then the latter shall come into the realm of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. His sons shall wage war and assemble a multitude of great forces, which shall keep coming and overflow and pass through, and again shall carry the war as far as his fortress. Then the king of the south, moved with rage, shall come out and fight against the king of the north. And he shall raise a great multitude, but it shall be given into his hand. And when the multitude is taken away, his heart shall be exalted, and he shall cast down tens of thousands, but he shall not prevail. For the king of the north shall again raise a multitude greater than the first, and after some years he shall come on with a great army and abundant supplies. In those times many shall arise against the king of the south, and the violent among your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fail. Then the king of the north shall come and throw up siege works and take a well-fortified city, and the forces of the south shall not stand, or even his best troops, for there shall be no strength to stand. But he who comes against him shall do as he wills, and none shall stand before him. And he shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his hand. He shall set aside his face to come with the strength of his whole kingdom, and he shall bring terms of an agreement and perform them. He shall give them the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom, but it shall not stand or be to his advantage. Afterward, he shall turn his face to the coastlands and shall capture many of them, but a commander shall put an end to his insolence. Indeed, he shall turn his insolence back upon him. Then he shall turn his face back toward the fortresses of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall, and shall not be found. Then shall arise in his place one who shall send an exactor of tribute for the glory of the kingdom. But within a few days he shall be broken, neither in anger nor in battle. In his place shall arise a contemptible person, to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant. And from the time that an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, and he shall become strong with a small people. Without warning he shall come into the richest parts of the province, and he shall do what neither his fathers nor his fathers' fathers have done, scattering among them plunder, spoil, and goods. He shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. And he shall stir up his power, and his heart against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall wage war with an exceedingly great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for plots shall be devised against him. Even those who eat his food shall break him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. And as for the two kings, their hearts shall be bent on doing evil. They shall speak lies at the same table, but to no avail. For the end is yet to be at the time appointed. And he shall return to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant, and he shall work his will and return to his own land. At the time appointed he shall return and come into the south, but it shall not be this time as it was before. For ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the holy covenant. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. And the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. When they stumble, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them with flattery. And some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time.
Good morning, church. We are down this morning to the last of 4 visions given to Daniel. You've made it this far. Well done. We are almost at the end. However, I'm sure as you can tell from this morning, there is still a lot of work to do. So Daniel receives this vision. You will remember this from last week. He receives this last vision on the back of an extended time of prayer and fasting, mainly because of what was happening back in Judah at the time. And this last vision we know must be really significant because in chapter 10, we see that Daniel has to be prepared to receive the vision. And he's prepared to receive the vision through the ministry of the pre-incarnate Jesus himself, which is amazing, and the words and touch of the angel Gabriel. And so after that encounter with Gabriel, as he's ready, we read these words going back to chapter 10 from last week. Gabriel said to him, verse 20, "Do you know why I've come to you? Now I'm going to return, engage in battle with the prince of Persia. And when I go, the prince of Greece is coming. However, I will first tell you what is written in a dependable book." Chapter 11 and chapter 12 is the contents of this last vision given to Daniel, which we're told basically Gabriel is narrating to him this vision, words that are written in a dependable book, or some translations say in the book of truth. What is this book of truth? I mean, we don't know. It's kind of this, the picture is of a heavenly record there's a record of predetermined events that are going to take place. And Gabriel says, I'm going to read to you these events that are about to take place. And that is the vision that we have before us in chapter 11 and chapter 12. Either way, what we're meant to get from this idea of the words from this book is the idea that the events described are events that have been prescribed. There's lots of events in chapter 11. I mean, could you keep up with everything that was going on? North, south, this, that, armies, Lots of events described to Daniel. Gabriel's narrating to him events that are going to happen. You're supposed to get the message that these many events described have in fact been prescribed, written by God. So what are these events? What are they detailing? Well, it is an incredibly, almost exhaustingly detailed prediction of world events, mainly to do with events that affected God's people back in Judah, as well as just for good measure, extra information thrown in about events related to the end times. That's the content of this last vision given to Daniel. And we'll get to the end times events next week. To start off with, I want to take your minds back to Daniel chapter 8. In many ways, chapter 8 and chapter 11 are quite similar. Remember, chapter 8 was this vision given to Daniel of the ram and the goat, where the focus in chapter 8 is on this flying unigoat. Do you remember? The flying unigoat with this great horn, and then that horn gets broken. In its place come up 4 other horns, and out of the one of the 4 horns comes this little horn, and that refers to the large horn is Alexander the Great. After his death, his empire gets divided amongst the 4 generals in his army, and eventually out of the dynasty or heritage of one of those generals comes this little horn, who is that guy Antiochus Epiphanes. Remember him, the great persecutor of the Jews in the Old Testament. Well, you've got to remember that that time period in chapter 8, so from big horn, Alexander, to little horn, Antiochus, is a time period of 160 years of history between those 2 events. Daniel 11, verse 2 to 35, packs in all of the information from that time period. But remember, this is predictions of events that for Daniel are 400 years into his future. So you get the idea. This is what we're talking about in Daniel 2 to Daniel 11, 2 to 35 is all of the events from the period of Alexander to that time period of Antiochus over a 160-year period. Now, by now, I hope, if you've been journeying with us in this series, I hope that by now you're already amazed at the detailed predictions of events which would happen hundreds of years after Daniel receives them, that come true with astonishing accuracy. I mean, I would hope that you're already amazed by that, and I really hope that what that does for you is that when we get to talking about predictions of events that are still in our future, that's what's so amazing here. There are still events, that's next week, in our future, that because we can look back and see how the other ones came exactly true, we can be entirely confident that these predictions of events will come true as well. If you have not yet been dazzled by this, well, Daniel 11 is for you. This vision, this passage is unparalleled in the Old Testament in prophetic text for its detail. There are over 100 specific details predicted here in that 160-year period, over 100 details that from our vantage point we can look back and see came absolutely true. So when I say incredibly detailed, I'm not just trying to be dramatic. It's exhaustingly detailed. Unfortunately, though, today, I don't have time to go through all 100 minute predictions and how they historically were fulfilled. So what I'm going to do this morning is just kind of lay general historical background, and then I'm going to hand pick just a few of those 100 predictions that came exactly true, which are just too amazing. Sound good? All the 2 people who love history are like, yeah, and the rest, well, hopefully it'll come together and make sense in the end. So these verses describe events that we now refer to as the 6 Syrian Wars. You can actually just go and look that up on Wikipedia. 6 Syrian Wars, not to be confused with modern Syrian refugee stuff. 2nd century, 3rd century BC, 6 Syrian Wars. Those are the events in Daniel 11, 2 to 35. It was a series of wars fought over a 100-year period, hence all the wars, this war, that war, that war. It's a series of wars fought over a 100-year period between 2 of the 4 kind of dynasties that came up after the death of Alexander the Great. And so to help you with this, to visualize this, I think it's going to be really important for today. Do not have a diagram, but Dave said diagrams are overrated. I have to get him back for that one. But I do have this morning a map for you. How cool? Full color map. So what you're looking at on the screen there is Alexander the Great's kind of original empire, and the 4 colors show you the division of his empire amongst his 4 generals. I'm going to read the names to you. I don't have the spellings up, but just listen to them. So firstly, Ptolemy, spelled with a P, but you don't say the P apparently. Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Cassander are the four generals who Alexander's empire was parceled out among. Now, the two of those guys and their sons and their dynasties were at war with each other for 100 years. Those two are in the green corner. In the green corner, the big green area is the dynasty, the Seleucid dynasty. And in the red corner, that's the kind of North Africa and Middle East portion, is the Ptolemaic dynasty. And for 100 years, these guys fought over the territory between them, territory that includes the ancient kingdom of Judah, modern day Palestine, Israel territory. They were fighting about. You could basically think of the kingdom of Judah as being a pinball stuck in a pinball machine, being pinged about between red and green and red and green, just fighting over this important territory. And before I go any further, maybe just to pause for a moment and just want you to think about that for a second, because you might be wondering, what on earth does this have to do with us today? Well, just think for a moment about all of the wars and bloodshed fought over that little piece of land. Just think about that. I mean, from the beginning of ancient historical records, like biblical records, like David and the Philistines and even the conquest before that, then into, the ruining of that by Babylon and all the skirmishes over it, with Egypt, even before the time of Babylon, leading to the exile. Now this 100-year war fought constantly over this territory. Then the Roman era, and remember all of the uprisings and revolts in the Roman era, leading eventually to the death of one of Jesus of Nazareth, because he was seen to be as one kind of instigating some of these things. The Crusades after that, 200 years of fighting over this little piece of land. Not to mention, of course, today, and the wars fought since the state of Israel was declared in 1948 to today. How much blood has been spilt over this tiny piece of land? There is something about this land that incites a clash of kingdoms. And that something about this land is it is the beautiful land. It is the glorious land. It is God's chosen dwelling place of old and will be his future place of rule in events yet to come. And so the earthly clash of kingdoms over this land is really just a subset of the heavenly clash of kingdoms. More on that subject another time. But for now, for you to know, ultimately after this 100-year war, it was the Seleucid dynasty that prevailed, the green guys up north based in Syria, and they would achieve their greatest success under their last king or leader, who was Antiochus Epiphanes. And so this table, put up the table on the screen, will just kind of show you all of the various sons, and over this 100-year period, you do not need to be taking good note of that table. I will come back to the bold bits in a little bit, but just note that it ends with that great persecutor of God's people, Antiochus Epiphanes. Now let me give you a few details, hand-selected details from this passage of some of the predictions and how they were fulfilled. So from verse 2 to 4, just traces all of the 4 Persian kings, and then comes Alexander passing out of his kingdom. Verse 5, let's just read verse 5 and 6 again. It says, "Then the king of the south and one of his subordinates will grow strong. His subordinate will resist him and will rule a kingdom greater than his. After some years have passed, they will form an alliance. Then the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to make an agreement, but she won't retain her power, nor will he continue in his strength. She, together with the one who brought her, her child, and her benefactor will all be delivered over at that time." Here's a quick cipher. Here's a clue. If you want to be reading Daniel 11 and know what's going on, every time you read king of the north in this section, which is very many times, you are referring to the Seleucid dynasty, the one that would result in Antiochus Epiphanes based in Syria. So king of the north is team green, and every time you read king of the south, you are referring to the descendants of Ptolemy based in Egypt, team red. Initially, the 2 original leaders, Seleucus and Ptolemy were actually in an alliance together. They together defeated one of the other Roman generals, and so they were in an alliance. They agreed to the settling of territories, but they never fully agreed on the territory comprising of Judah, which was a big mistake, because the next 100 years of war was because they never settled that territory. After the death of the original Ptolemy and Seleucus, their sons started fighting over this territory. The first Syrian war, 3 years. Second Syrian war, 7 years. When peace finally came in around the 250s BCE, that peace was strengthened through a marriage alliance. Now, this is all detail. We have accurate historical records, and just remember what was predicted here. There's this marriage alliance that kind of brings together this peace treaty, and that refers to the daughter of the king of the south. Remember that? That's this lady named as Berenice, was given over to be the wife of the king of the north, Antiochus II. Not Epiphanes, he's the fourth. But this didn't really work. This alliance didn't work because of politics. Lots of politics. So Antiochus, north dude, was poisoned by his original wife, who did not take kindly to a new wife being given over, and had a son, and she did not want that son to be the king. She wanted her son to be. So she poisoned Antiochus, killed her husband, and then Berenice, the one given from the south to the north, was killed by the other supporters of Antiochus, who also didn't want that son becoming king. All of that drama in 2 verses of Daniel chapter 11. If you go back and read verse, whatever it was, 5 to 6, you can see those details exactly playing out in this whole affair with Berenice and the king of the north and king of the south at the time. The wars of their descendants continue. 3rd Syrian War, 4th Syrian War. You can go and read up about all of these things. Verse 10 to 13, I like this story. This is describes, or predicts actually, the famous Battle of Raphia. And if you're reading back in verses 10 to 13, you'll just see it's this kind of huge war that big amassed a great army and went to avenge and fight the king of the north. And this is the Battle of Raphia, which happened June 22nd, 217 BC, in an area known today as Gaza. Interesting. In this huge battle, we have these historical accounts. I mean, it's just amazing. In this battle, so Team Red, Ptolemy, had 70,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and 73 African war elephants. Antiochus in the north had 62,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and 103 elephants, but this time the larger Asian type of elephant. And the king of the south this time, Ptolemy, won this great victory. And so clearly the point there is to show the superiority of the African elephant over even the larger Asian elephant. Clearly. I kid you not though, I actually don't recommend you do this, but there's a ton of debate around the influence of the African and Asian elephants in this particular war. But Team Africa won that day, so let's just record and note that. So Antiochus III at this point loses badly, but he recovers, and he actually goes on to massively dominate the region for many years, which again is as predicted. Rome was now rising as a new power. And so Rome starts to interfere with all of this. And so that prompts Antiochus III, still not the 4th Epiphanes, to kind of make an alliance with Rome through a kind of diplomatic maneuver through political marriage. So Antiochus in the north, we know this is history. Antiochus in the north gives his daughter, only 10 years old, to be wed to the 16-year-old Egyptian king Ptolemy V. The name of that 10-year-old daughter given in marriage is Cleopatra. The Cleopatra, this is Daniel 11, is telling us about the one who would become the great queen of Egypt. That's exactly the events recorded here. And so this happens to try and do this maneuver, but Antiochus has treachery in mind. This is not a goodwill thing. We read it in verse 17. He will give the king of the south a daughter in marriage in order to destroy the kingdom. But we read that that didn't work. It did not turn out to his advantage. From verse 21, we are introduced now to, again, Antiochus Epiphanes, and we're quite familiar with him from Daniel chapter 8. We know he wasn't the rightful heir. It was through deceit and treachery. That's what verse 21 says. There will arise in his place, Antiochus III, a despicable person. And when it's despicable, it's always Antiochus Epiphanes, to whom royal honor has not rightfully been conferred. It was through treachery. At some point in what would be the final battle between the king of the north, this is Antiochus Epiphanes, and the king of the south, Ptolemy VI, I think, at this time. At some point in their final battle, they actually get together. They meet, we have this in history, they meet in a tent to make a peace deal. I mean, not unlike all these peace deals in the past over that territory. But really, they have different intentions in mind. And so we read this in verse 27. These two kings, their minds filled with evil intentions, will trade lies with one another at the same table. So this happened. These guys met to work out a peace deal. Neither intended keeping that deal, just as predicted. Now, at this point, there's a really important phrase just thrown in here that I want you to note. So these two kings, their mind filled with evil intentions, will trade lies with one another at the same table, but it will not succeed, for there is still an end at the appointed time. That's a really important statement because it takes us back to Daniel 10 and this book, this heavenly book, this book of truth, this dependable book that Gabriel is narrating to Daniel. In other words, this peace treaty won't stand because it has not been prescribed that it would yet be a time of peace. God has not determined that things still need to take place. There's still events, difficult events, as we're going to see, still have to take place. In other words, everything at this point, verse 27, 100 years of history with all this detail. The point is, everything is happening exactly by the book. Literally, by the book, God's prescribed plan. Then things heat up in verse 28, and this is just really meaningful. It could have been peace. God said, no, not yet. Verse 28, then the king of the north, Antiochus Epiphanes, will return to his own lands after this peace deal, which doesn't work. He'll return to his own land, so he goes back to Syria, northeast, comes through Judah, and his mind will be set against the Holy Covenant. So he comes back and he's just going through Judah, and as he's going back through that land, he's just changed. He's like, I hate these people. Really, that's what we read. His mind is set against the Holy Covenant. He will take action, meaning there's things that he's going to do in that space before he goes back to Syria. And so we know from history what happened is he comes through Judah, just this impulse in his heart, which could only have been incited by Satan himself, the real oppressor of God's people, incites him to go back, and he plunders the temple, goes into the temple, just takes stuff from it as wealth back to Syria. Verse 29 to 31 describe events leading up to, we looked at this in chapter 8, leading up to that most despicable action, the abomination of desolation. So in verse 29, at an appointed time, he will again invade the south. He's going to come try again, but this latter visit won't turn out the way the former one did. The ships of Kittim will come against him, leaving him disheartened. Remember that. He will turn back and direct his indignation against the Holy Covenant. He'll return and honor those who forsake the Holy Covenant. His forces will rise up and profane the fortified sanctuary, stopping the daily sacrifice. In its place, they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. And so the story here is Antiochus comes one last time against Ptolemy VI, and this time he fails because of Rome's influence. The ships of Kittim refers to Rome, who had basically had enough of Antiochus trying to take over the world, and especially Africa, which Rome was trying to protect. And so the story goes, not story, history goes, that this Roman consul, the most amazing name, Gaius Popilius Leonas, I just wanted to, you don't have to remember that, but it just sounds so rad. I just wanted to say that name. Moves to confront Antiochus. And so Antiochus gets handed a letter, this is history, from the Roman Senate ordering Antiochus not to fight against Egypt anymore. And this is how history records this confrontation. Here's how it goes. Popilius refused to acknowledge Antiochus' greeting, like, no, we're not friends, and presented him with the Roman ultimatum, which was very straightforward in its demand: the immediate cessation of the war and complete withdrawal from Egypt in the shortest time possible. When Antiochus asked for time to consider, this is awesome. Just take note if you have enemies and you're looking for a cool tactic. When Antiochus asked time to consider, Popilius drew a circle with a stick around the king and bade him to give his answer to the note within that circle. You're not leaving the circle until you give me an answer. And so this Seleucid king, Antiochus Epiphanes, agrees to the ultimatum and retreats back to Syria, disheartened, the prediction was. It's a bit of a euphemism. He's humiliated and passes through Judah. What do you think he's going to do? He's mad, right, in his indignation. And so he passes through Judah, this time humiliated, tears down the walls, murders thousands of Jews, storms into the Holy of Holies, and erects the abomination of desolation on the altar of burnt offering. All that we looked at in chapter 8. These were the events that incited those particular events. That's just a snapshot. I think I just gave you 3 major events. They were predicted to Daniel 400 years before these events, and you've seen the stunning accuracy with which they came true. Isn't that amazing? Now, the real question is, really my job today, because my job today isn't actually to give you a history lesson, although, what fun, but that's really not the point. The point is, why do we have this? Why do we have this material in our Bibles? And perhaps more relevant for today, why is it worth you studying this, us studying this together on a Sunday morning? I mean, you came out to church today, thank you, it's awesome to have you. Why did you come to church to have a history lesson? Well, I could answer that question, why do we have this material, in the exact same way that I answered it back in chapter 8, because those points of application apply absolutely equally here. And so, in fact, that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to take 2 of the points I had in 3 in chapter 8, just 2 of them, and I want to just expand on them, go deeper with them. So, number 1, why we have this material, why it's worth studying this, is for us to realize, I hope you realize this today, number 1, that God's word is elastic. It's elastic, and you'll see what I mean by that in a moment. So in chapter 8, the first application was I spoke about God's word, the Bible, and I called it the magic book. Do you remember that? Just this idea of back then, chapter 8, we were already amazed at these detailed predictions that came true with stunning accuracy. We were amazed then. And it's been amplified today. Am I right? I mean, amplified. This 100 event detail, your confidence in the book that you hold, the Bible, your confidence in that book being supernatural, and I use that word technically and carefully, supernatural in its origin, that at least for Daniel 11, at least for those chapters, is actually just a memo or a transcription of a heavenly book in which these events are written. Your confidence in the scripture that we hold being supernatural should be at record high. Should be at record high at that moment. But more than that, what I want to add today goes a bit deeper than that. So, warning, what follows may be a little bit of a rabbit trail. And I'm prone to following rabbit trails, although I did not fully follow the elephant story, which I could have. So, credit for not following every rabbit trail. But I would like to follow this little rabbit trail. I feel like, or I hope that it's going to be helpful to you. So I want you to just thought experiment, or just think. I want you to think about what the Jews, God's people, at the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, so while he was murdering them and tearing copies of the Torah, all the things we learned, while he was persecuting God's people, I want you to think about, how did they fortify themselves? How did they strengthen each other amidst this horrendous persecution? What were they doing to remain faithful? Would they, those people then, like the year 167 BC, would they have heard of Daniel's predictions? Do you think? Would they have had copies of these scriptures? Would they be reading Daniel? And if so, do you think they would be massively comforted by the knowledge that, hey, things are crazy, this is terrible, but actually it's exactly as God prescribed it to be. There must be a plan here. Do you think they would somehow be encouraged by that? What do you think? would they be reading Daniel and be comforted and encouraged? So this is where it gets interesting. Because we're in history and timelines here, there's a unique event that I think is helpful for us today. So I think I want us to think about, I think this is important, kind of where the Bible comes from in general, but did they, the Jews at the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, have an Old Testament? Did they have that? So what we have today, historically, in terms of the Bible, is we have copies, full copies of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament in Hebrew, but the copies that we have only date to 1,000 years after Christ, 1000 AD. We have copies of that. We also have fragments, lots of fragments, Dead Sea Scrolls of Hebrew Old Testament passages, no complete books, but just fragments dating back to 100 years before the time of Christ. And now we're getting much closer to that time period. But what we also have right now, we have copies of a Greek translation of the entire Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, hundreds of copies of this Greek translation of the Old Testament dated back to 300 BC. So back to this time period. And so this Greek translation of the Old Testament, we're familiar scholars with it today. It's known as a Septuagint, based on the Latin word for 70, because 70 Jewish scribes were commissioned by a particular Greek king. The language of the time was Greek, thanks to Alexander the Great. And so a Greek king commissioned 70 Jewish scholars, uber nerds, to translate the Old Testament. So they had Old Testament copies. We don't have them, but they commissioned them to translate the copies of Old Testament in Hebrew that they had into Greek. Now, when you're mapping out just the parallels in history, guess who or when that commission happened. The Septuagint was first formed. Well, if you bring up the table back up on the screen, that's the bold in the top left table. That guy, you can just look in history. He's the one who commissioned the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which we still have copies of today. So just while all this wild stuff is going on, God is still at the same time commissioning this. So the Jewish people at the time for sure had Old Testaments, and we know that because we have these Greek Old Testaments that show they were reading the scriptures. They had them. And they were reading Daniel, and for sure being encouraged by the fact that events happening in their time, as difficult as they were prescribed and God was in control. Now I just want you to think about the elastic band. This is a long elastic band because Daniel's encouraged through this vision, and he's encouraged by it. 400 years later, Jews are encouraged by Daniel. And as we go to the future with events that are difficult, what do you think we're going to be using to encourage ourselves? The same copy, the same scroll. God's word is elastic. If you think about the centuries of people who have been encouraged by the very same passage. And so I want to just say to you today, at the very least, we're in our own particular moment of struggle. There is an increasing climate of objection to Christianity, and there's just a lot of stuff going on. It seems like the world is suffocating around us. But we're not alone as we read these scriptures today. That's why we read them today, because they're elastic. And what it meant and what it did for people in real persecution then will carry us through and even to future persecution. So, all that to say, if ever you should be trusting your Bible and using it in your life, now would be a good time. Secondly, I want to say, to acknowledge today, and at least, I hope you get this, to acknowledge that God's plan is perfect. How many times have I said that this series? I don't know if I've said it in those exact words, but I've said the idea hundreds of times. I said that back in chapter 8, that what it shows us is God is in control even when it doesn't look like it. Again, I want to expand on that today. And I want to expand on it by telling you a story of some missionaries back in the 1950s. A story that if you've been a Christian for a long time, I'm sure you know it, but told from the view of someone I hadn't heard before. So you can go and read the story, a guy by the name of Steve Saint. Easy to remember, Steve Saint. Desiring God Conference 2005 tells this story. Steve Saint is the son of Nate Saint, who was one of 5 young missionary men who were tragically speared to death by a tribe on the beaches of Ecuador in the 1950s. If you're familiar with the story, you're most likely familiar through the lens of one of the other guys, Jim Elliot. And he's a famous missionary, has a famous saying, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose." And so these guys, these 5 missionaries, had been on this long journey trying to reach this Wayodani tribe. And I mean, they'd spent months engaging with them very strategically. So Steve Saint's dad, Nate Saint, was actually the pilot who would fly a plane and drop down this bucket with like gifts. And so that, kind of these guys would know that they're friends. And eventually this tribe exchanged gifts. And so they knew it seems like we are in a place where we can have relationship with one another. And so they landed on the beach the one day, and tragically they were set up. They were deceived by the tribe, who came and brutally murdered every one of them. Now, Steve is the son of one of those missionaries who was killed. And at this conference, 50 years later, he tells the story of how as a young boy, so Steve Saint at the time, his father was tragically speared to death, was 5 years old. And so he tells the story, and I have a son 5 years old, and it's just wild to think about this, but he tells the story of how he, as a 5-year-old boy, just struggled with this, didn't know what was happening. And his mom just had to tell him that, Dad's not coming. He's gone to live with Jesus. They had to kind of figure out what that had meant. And as he grew up, he really wrestled with why God allowed this event to happen. But now he says this, and you must just read it yourself. It's important that you know these are his words. But now he said he realizes that God didn't just tolerate it. God did not allow this to happen. What Steve Saint says about his dad is God planned for that death to happen, which is really hard. I mean, I could not say that to somebody else. You've got to hear this from the son who has lost his dad and said he believes God didn't just allow it, God planned it. And God planned it because now, 50 years later, we see God used that incident to pave the way for this entire tribe to be saved. And maybe you know the story of how that happened. I mean, it's a stunning story. The wives of these 5 dead missionaries go back to reconnect with this tribe, and their forgiveness and their generosity just moves this whole tribe, and nearly all of them come to faith. Now, several years later, in fact, Steve got to baptize the man, his name was Minkaya, who had speared his father to death. He baptized him. And he'll tell the story. Steve says that this man, Minkaya, who had killed his dad, became like a grandfather of his kids, a beloved member of the family. And they would go tour and speak together, and Steve would translate for Minkaya. And then he said this, Steve said this is the point of the story. One of the most powerful statements I've heard, and I really think it's what we need to get from Daniel 11. He says this: why is it that we want every chapter of our lives to be good when God promises only that in the last chapter, he will make all the other chapters make sense? You have to hear it from the guy himself. Why is it we want every chapter to be good when actually God only promises that the last chapter is perfect and good, and then all the other chapters make sense in light of that? Why do we do this? Is it just me, or do we generally have that expectation that every chapter in our lives is going to be perfect, and every chapter is going to be filled with joy and success and prosperity and peace? Am I right? We just generally have this expectation that every chapter is going to be good. And in fact, if you read any great story, no great story, every chapter is good. Where did we get this expectation from? All we're promised, for sure, is that the very last chapter is perfect. And in light of that, all the other chapters make sense. This, I think, is exactly what Daniel 11 is telling us. He's telling the people of God, for 100 years, there's going to be mayhem, and it's prescribed for you. I mean, those people would live out their lifetimes with every chapter being one of persecution. It's been told, it's been said, this is what you are to expect, but hold on, because the last chapter is perfect, and in it, everything else makes sense. I want to say to you this morning, church, there are tough chapters written in every book of life here. I know you know that, but we don't really live like that's true. There are tough chapters written in our books, but they are all working together in a storyline that ends with this beautiful, grand finale in which everything makes sense. You know, we just got back last week from a family holiday, about 7 days, I wish 7 weeks, at the coast, which had worked really hard. Things were really crazy up to the holiday, and we're going to be crazy afterwards, but we were just really looking forward to it. I mean, kids were counting the days, and I was like, it's 7 weeks to go. And they're like, how long is 7 weeks? And I said, well, a week is 7 years. So I said, I have to say it's 6 Fridays, because they know what a Friday means, movie and an ice cream. So we've been really looking forward to this, like, let's just make it through, let's push through, because we can have this amazing holiday. But to be honest, the holiday tour was a bit of a disaster. Starting with my own bicycle accident, which happened on the exact same day that Dave's bicycle happened. But let me just clear something up. No, we did not cycle into each other. We did not crash into each other. I was in KZN. Dave was in Gauteng. It just so happened that at exactly the same time, we both had these bicycle accidents. And so there was 2 days of our holiday gone. And, a lot of other things happened. And so Kristen and I were just talking one day in the car and just thinking, we had this expectation that things are tough and going to be tough, but we've got this holiday, and you just anticipate that everything's going to be perfect, right? It just is. We'll get to the holiday. And it absolutely was not perfect. And we realized, why is it that we expected that to happen? It's not like we go down there and go, that the world knows I'm on holiday. All you drivers in KZN, please note, this person is on holiday. Approach very carefully in your motor vehicle. We all got the stomach bug, that one that's going around in KZN, the rugby teams, the whole deal. We all got that. It's not like the stomach bugs were alerted. These guys are from Gauteng. They're on holiday. Do not infect them. His infection is only for KZN people. Do you know what I mean? But we did. We were so disappointed that things didn't turn out the way we wanted, because we just expected that it would, all go well. And we realized it's not realistic to expect that things go well on our own timetable. That's the point. It's not realistic, and it's not a biblical worldview that informs the expectation that things go well on our own timetable. Listen, there is a timetable, and it is precise, and it is perfect, but it's going to play out very differently to how we would have wanted it to be. Let's pray. God, would you help us to know this? We really need help. We do. We come before you as people who knows how it all happened, but believing we are ultimately in control and anxious over so many things and have all these expectations, and yet find ourselves mostly with our chapters being written in ways we would not have wanted. Help us to know that at the end, when that book is finally closed and we look back, that we will see you standing right beside us every step of the way as you've promised, and we accept and receive that promise. And at the same time, we will see your perfect and good plan. So help us to just believe that. I honestly just ask you this morning, Lord, to help us believe that to be a sincere, deep trust of ours in you, in your precise and perfect plan. And give us the strength and the faith to hold on through the hard chapters. And God, I pray for all those this morning who are going through really hard chapters. Just pour out your grace and strengthen them. You have promised us more than just a perfect end. You've promised us your presence, and so we receive that. Your strengthening, your grace that strengthens us to faithfully persevere and to do it with hope, looking with a longing and a delight in that perfect grand finale and an eternal, bright, awesome future. I pray that in Jesus' name. Amen.